Welcome, everybody. We're just waiting as people come in. Welcome, everybody. We're starting in a few moments, but we're just waiting as people join. Yeah, people are still joining. Okay. So I think we'll start. Still people trickling in, but I think we'll start. So welcome, everybody, to today's IDA Insight Hour. It's the first one of 2025. Probably just still time to say Happy New Year to everybody. Hope you all had a good break over the holiday period. So I'm Susan Bright, the CEO of IDA. We are a network of over 1,800 employers across the UK. And our mission is to equip employers to support all of their employees impacted by domestic abuse and to share best practice with each other. We aim to bring about constructive change leading to a society where victims and survivors of domestic abuse thrive and where domestic abuse is not tolerated. So today's topic is domestic abuse and employers' legal obligations, but a few points of housekeeping before we start. We will take questions from the audience in the last part of the webinar. There is a Q&A box, so can I encourage everybody to start putting your questions in the Q&A box as we go. You also, as an audience, have access to the chat function, so please post comments in the chat. We encourage you to say hello, where you're from. And then you can also live tweet during the webinar using the hashtag IDA Insight Hour. As ever, in terms of putting things in the chat or in anything that you choose to tweet about, please be mindful of the subject matter and be respectful of the impact on others. The Insight Hour today is going to be recorded, and we will share the recording and also a summary of the key points so you can share this within your organisation with others who weren't able to join us today. We do appreciate, of course, that domestic abuse is a really challenging subject, so if at any time you want to step away, please do so. So as I said, today's focus is an employer's legal obligations in relation to domestic abuse. And I'm delighted to be joined by our two speakers today, Anvita Sharma from Hogan Lovells and Jim Fitzgerald from Baringa. And I'm going to ask each of them to introduce themselves briefly before we turn to our panel session. So Anvita, can I ask you to go first?
Yes, of course. And hello, everyone. As Susan says, my name is Anvita Sharma. I'm a counsel in the Hogan Lovells London employment team, and I specialise in advising employers on all aspects of employment law, but in particular, I do give advice on issues relating to domestic abuse and how they might interact with an employer's obligations in the workplace. I'm very happy to be here today.
Thanks, Anvita. It's great to have you. And Jim, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thank you, Susan, and thanks for asking me to join. So my name's Jim Fitzgerald. I'm a director in Baringa. We're a management consulting firm. I'm based at our head office here in London, about 2,000 employees globally. I'm in our consulting practice, so I'm day-to-day work is advising clients, but I also sit on our gender diversity network as we're a leading employer who looks to encourage and drive diversity in our workforce. So women's safety is an important topic. I chair our working group on that, and I'm going to share some of the best practice that we've been doing, bringing, I guess, the theory that Anvita will talk about in terms of the legal obligation through to the practical implementation and the ways in which we've found and discovered lessons around how to drive that change.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jim. So we're going to share a few slides just to take us through this. So if we could share the slides, and then I'll start off with a bit of an introduction before turning to Anvita and then to Jim. I think the slides will come on in a moment. Thank you. So we're often asked, I think the understanding amongst employers across the UK about domestic abuse and the fact it is a business issue is so much improved over the last few years, but we're still quite often at IDA asked that question, well, what are an employer's legal obligations in relation to domestic abuse? What has it got to do with work? Surely domestic abuse is a private matter, not something for an employer to get involved with. Those questions, are still out there. And so our starting point is to look at the evidence and the statistics. And those show us that 1 in 4 women, 1 in 7 men, or 1 in 5 of your employees will experience domestic abuse in their lifetimes. And the numbers in terms of people across the country is about 2 million people per year. I mean, it's an enormous number of people, and that's adults. And you think about the impact on children and the wider family and colleagues and so forth. Many forms of domestic abuse are a crime, but yet domestic abuse is largely hidden. I have really found, since I took on this role at IDA a couple of years ago, that I honestly can't go into a social situation and talk about what I'm doing without somebody coming forward and sharing either their own story or their experience of somebody very close to them, and it's just everywhere. There is a Domestic Abuse Act of 2021, and that provided for the first time a statutory definition of domestic abuse. And domestic abuse is a term that covers a wide range of harmful behaviours between family members where each person is aged 16 or over. But the types of abusive behaviour are very widespread, and often people think about physical violence, sexual violence, but it includes economic abuse, psychological abuse, and very particularly coercive and controlling behaviour. And really at the centre of abuse is this aspect of control. And domestic abuse can be a single incident, but it is more likely to be a pattern of behaviour over time. It can happen to anybody, any gender, any age, any role, junior people, senior people within your organisation, whether somebody lives with disabilities, whatever their background, their sexual orientation, and so forth. It is just widespread and everywhere. Clearly, there is an impact in the workplace. Few of us can really leave our home lives at home as we go into work. And that is particularly the case for people dealing with abuse in terms of their ability to get to work and also the ability to concentrate and be productive at work. I think we and many employers realised during COVID about the extent of domestic abuse. The number of people needing to call helplines skyrocketed. And I think a lot of employers realise the importance of the workplace being open so that people could go to a safe space. So work can be, for many people, a safe space. It can also, with the right culture, be a place where people can seek help to deal with their situation. So turning to the legal obligations, employers do have legal obligations in this space, and they are likely to grow. So the newish government has committed to cut violence against women and girls, which includes domestic abuse and includes, obviously, domestic abuse, whatever the gender of the victim and survivor. The government has committed to reduce that by 50% over the next decade, and that can only be achieved by everybody working together, whether that's the government, specialist domestic abuse services, and employers are an enormously important part of that collective response. So the legal position is that employers have a duty of care to their employees, and that means that they need to abide by relevant law. And that includes, for example, health and safety law. So the Health and Safety at Work Act of 1974, so quite a long time ago, requires employers, they have a duty of every employer to ensure, so far as reasonably practicable, the health, safety and welfare at work of their employees. And there are regulations which require employers to undertake risk assessments to identify and adopt mechanisms to eliminate or reduce risks to their employees' health safety and well-being. And where there is a known risk of domestic abuse, this can include ensuring a safe working environment, for example. Employment law can also come into play, for example, when dealing with a victim survivor of domestic abuse, and also when dealing with a perpetrator of domestic abuse. So it may come to your attention in the workplace that you have a perpetrator of abuse, and employment law could very much be engaged in various aspects of dealing with people. Very importantly, I mentioned the Domestic Abuse Act of 2021. There is statutory guidance that accompanies that act, and in that statutory guidance, it is made clear, I've put it on this slide at paragraph 406, that employers should consider the impact of domestic abuse on their employees as part of their duty of care. And quite helpfully, the statutory guidance goes on to share some best practice guidance, some of which Jim will no doubt talk about in practice in a few moments. But the statutory guidance says that employers should develop policies to set out their approach to domestic abuse within their workforce, including, for example, signposting to specialist organisations, the roles and responsibilities within the organisation, any education and training that is available, and the practical support that can be offered to victims in the workforce and their approach to perpetrators. The guidance includes suggestions of the sort of support that an employer might provide. So it could be access to paid leave, more flexible working arrangements, which could be helpful if somebody needs to attend court, for example, or other appointments relating to domestic abuse, or finding safe accommodation, for example, if they're leaving an abusive situation. The guidance says that employers should consult with staff, trade unions, employee representatives and others in order to, and specialist domestic abuse charities in order to develop and implement and maintain a policy. At IDA, for our members, we have a whole handbook which can take you through how to put in place a good response and a template policy as well that you're most welcome to use. So that's my piece on the existing law that one needs to think about. And I'm now going to hand on to Anvita to talk about the Worker Protection Act, which came into effect very recently and which has other obligations on employers. So Anvita, over to you.
Thank you, Susan. So the Worker Protection Act came into force in October of last year, and it essentially introduces a preventative duty on employers to take reasonable steps to prevent sexual harassment. So it doesn't apply to wider forms of harassment in relation to other characteristics that are protected under the Equality Act, like things like race or sexual orientation or religion or belief. It is focused on sexual harassment, which is defined as unwanted conduct of a sexual nature, which has the purpose or effect of creating an intimidating, hostile, degrading, humiliating, or offensive environment for the employee. Now, whilst employers can bring claims of sexual harassment in the workplace against their employers in the ordinary course, this new duty does not create a freestanding right for employees to bring a new claim against their employers if there's been a failure to comply with the duty. But what can happen is if an employee is successful in a harassment claim at the employment tribunal, and a tribunal feels that there has been a failure to comply with this duty to take reasonable steps to prevent sexual harassment, an uplift of up to 25% to any compensation awarded can be granted. And the way the uplift works is essentially, if the employer has taken no steps to comply with the duty, a full uplift of 25% will be awarded. If some steps have been taken, a lower uplift may be awarded. But the real crux of this new duty is the involvement of the Equalities and Human Rights Commission, which is the regulator which regulates compliance with the Equalities Act in the UK. They are able to enforce this duty, and they have a range of powers to enforce the duty. So the EHRC can investigate a potential breach, and it can issue unlawful act notices, typically what they tend to do is they enter into voluntary agreements with organizations where an employer agrees to take certain steps to remedy any defects identified by the Equalities and Human Rights Commission, and then the Commission will monitor compliance over the coming years. And so these types of steps can include requiring the updating of policies, implementation of training on harassment, and they're widely publicized. Some of you may have seen recently, there's been a lot of press around McDonald's and claims that steps haven't been taken to address sexual harassment in the workplace at McDonald's, despite the Commission's intervention. They also have issued technical guidance, which is very useful because it sets out exactly what the Commission views as reasonable steps. And it's pretty clear from the guidance that they expect employers to undertake risk assessments. It's not sufficient to just have a policy in place. You'll need to assess the risk, and they'll really be looking at the size and resources of the employer, the nature of the working environment, including the sector, the types of risks that have been identified, and of course the measures that have been adopted, and whether there's been an assessment of the effectiveness of any measures adopted in the past.
Thanks, Amvita. So do you see any potential overlap in an employer's new responsibilities in relation to preventing sexual harassment and responsibilities in relation to domestic abuse?
Yes, there is definitely a potential for overlap, because the definition of sexual harassment is unwanted conduct of a sexual nature. There could be, of course, domestic abuse, which relates to sexual abuse. And what is required is that an employee is subjected to sexual harassment in the course of their employment. So you could have a scenario where the victim of the abuse is subjected to sexual harassment by a colleague who is also in an intimate personal relationship with that victim. So you'd be engaging with issues of domestic abuse in the workplace, as well as the duty to prevent sexual harassment. The duty also doesn't actually exclude harassment by third parties in the course of employment. So if you have a victim of abuse who's an employee and their partner is not an employee but is a third party who perhaps arrives at the workplace and tries to intervene in workplace events or whilst the employee is working remotely, again, the duties could be engaged. So it's something to take into consideration when employers are looking at their risk assessments, whether domestic abuse issues should be considered as well.
Thank you. That's super helpful. Do you want to talk a little bit about the Employment Rights Bill, which is going through Parliament at the moment? And I know that there are some, potential issues there, and there may of course be amendments put down to that which also impact domestic abuse.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Employment Rights Bill has a couple of interesting reforms proposed. So none of this is in law at the moment, but it sort of sets out where the government's thinking is and possible change in the future. So I mentioned that currently we have a preventative duty to take reasonable steps to prevent sexual harassment, which is in law. But in the draft of the Employment Rights Bill, the duty to prevent sexual harassment is a duty to take all reasonable steps. So that's a higher standard that employers will be held to than the current guidance and position in the law. And the Employment Rights Bill also reintroduces protections against third-party harassment, which is not focused solely on sexual harassment. So any harassment, so any unwanted conduct that has a purpose or effect of creating a hostile or humiliating work environment related to a protected characteristic. So as I mentioned before, things like race or disability or sexual orientation, etc. Employers will have a duty to take all reasonable steps to prevent their employees from being subjected to harassment by a third party, so someone who's not an employee of the organization. And that's a new duty that the Employment Rights Bill looks to introduce. Now, we don't really know what the reasonable steps requirements look like, and we might get more guidance from the government in the coming months, but those are some things to look out for.
So where do you see potentially the Employment Rights Bill being engaged in relation to domestic abuse then?
So I think obviously having a higher standard of duty to prevent sexual harassment is absolutely relevant to employers, but I think the introduction of protections against third-party harassment are where these issues may overlap with domestic abuse issues, because any sort of abuse, be it, let's say, emotional abuse, for example, related to, or verbal abuse related to an individual's protected characteristics, which an employee is subjected to by someone who's not an employee of the organization. So again, perhaps a partner, or someone they formerly had a personal relationship with. If that is carried out in the course of their employment, so at workplace events or whilst they're working from home, again, the duties are engaged. And here, if there is a failure to comply with those duties, employees could bring claims against their employer for a failure to prevent third-party harassment. There's absolutely an area where I could see an overlap with domestic abuse issues.
Yeah, the challenges of people who are working from home. I mean that really gives you pause for thought as an employer as to how you fulfill your duties in that situation. Yeah. We might come back to that. Let's move on, Jim, to you now. Sort of with all of that sort of context from a legal perspective, I mean, the law is the law, but it's turning out into a practical application in a workplace that, in a way that works within your organisation. Would you be able to share with us what you do at Baringa?
Yep. Thank you, Susan. So yeah, just a quick introduction, background context, I guess, for Baringa. Many of you probably haven't never heard of us. We're a management consultancy, as I mentioned, headquartered in London, but we've offices globally, so the US, Asia, Australia, Middle East, Europe. We're about 2,000 people globally, and we're the way our business operates is we're consultants, and we're often working on clients' sites. So we do have an office, but normally in the course of work, people are working directly in client sites, or as Susan was mentioning, even working at home. So our kind of duty of care, if you like, kind of extends into third-party locations, which can be challenging for us. So obviously outside of our control. So in our gender diversity network, we're hoping, obviously aiming to grow female and representation at all levels in our organization. That means us needing to create an atmosphere that attracts and retains talented women in our business. And within that, we've got a women's safety working group, because what we started to see was a need for us to create, as Anvita's shown, both a combination of legal responsibility, but also from a good business practice, a need to create a workplace which has the objective, as I've shown at the top of this slide, to prevent harassment, abuse, and violence against women, both inside and outside our workplace, and to upskill all of our staff to be able to put those measures in place. We've included both inside and outside the workplace for pretty obvious reasons, and I think they've been touched on earlier. We do have a lot of our workforce working at home, so we don't have direct control on the situations they find themselves there, but we do need to provide support to them. And as I mentioned, on client sites and traveling to and from client sites are also areas that we need to be able to provide support to female colleagues. The upskilling of our staff is really key, because and I can say this speaking as a man, this topic is a blind spot for men generally. So raising awareness at all levels in our organization is actually a first step, because this topic just doesn't figure in quite a lot of male experiences. This is normally something that obviously women are very conscious and aware of, but for men, and that issue drives into businesses because, unfortunately, the way the world works is, our senior leaders tend to be male. So there isn't a representation at senior levels of organizations around, women's voices on this topic. So we've chunked up 4 kind of areas of work streams, if you like. The first and most important is around strategic leadership. And I saw a question in the Q&A earlier around how to ensure this kind of legal obligation and the measures you put in place stick in the organization, and securing senior leadership sponsorship is the absolute first step. I mean, we know from all sorts of business regulations and so on that, there can be a law in place and you can put a policy in force, and it'll sit on your company's intranet and not really get used or picked up on. So as well as having a domestic abuse policy, which I'll go into on our next slide, we need to have the culture that enables that policy to actually get used in practice. And there's 2 lenses on it. One is that people can detect when there is domestic abuse or sexual harassment happening in the workforce, impacting on people's performance. And then secondly, that people who are experiencing sexual harassment or domestic abuse know the policies and support that are available to them. It's not necessarily something they'll pick up on in the normal course of business. You'll try and train them in onboarding that they've got X, Y, and Z benefits available to them, but when you're in a difficult situation, it isn't always obvious that those things are available to you. So that's the strategic leadership pillar, really, is getting that sponsorship and having those policies in place, the systems working, and the tools available to people is a fundamental point. Second area is around engaging men. So as I mentioned, raising awareness amongst men is important because at the moment it's not something they know about in many cases, and it's also problematically not a topic that they'll often voluntarily engage with. So there can be quite a challenge to communicate the importance of this topic to men, because they'll often, frankly, and I've done this myself, self-select out of these types of topics because they are uncomfortable conversations. And if they feel it's not something that impacts their day-to-day, then why would they get involved? So we've got a big program of upskilling ambassadors through our business, whose job is to facilitate those discussions within individual teams. What we've noticed in practice is that having a policy at the firm level and a HR team that's implementing that policy doesn't necessarily touch on the day-to-day or lived experience for people. So having that engaged male allyship embedded within teams and businesses on a day-to-day basis is very important. That culture needs to be open and honest. So the third pillar around embedding that culture across our business is really key. We as an organization have used White Ribbon as our external organization. They've got a very helpful 3-year action plan that helps us have a program of work and a way in which we can share best practice. There's lots of other organizations that do the same, including obviously Susan and everyone here at EIDA. So that's something that is definitely recommended, is to learn from other organizations and adopt best practice. Having good examples of male allyship, promoting that in day-to-day working, and particularly for us as a consulting organization, ensuring that that happens on a client basis as well is key. Then final area then is around raising awareness. So both internally within our own firm to make sure everybody understands the expectations and obligations on them, but also externally. So, we join external webinars like this, try and share best practice, advocate for policy changes. As Susan's mentioning, there's lots moving in the space, which we're definitely supportive around, and engaging with our clients. So, for us, having clients who also understand and appreciate the importance of this to not just our employees, but also their employees, and sharing and helping each other is very important. So we're undertaking a number of roundtable knowledge share events as well on that side. So that's kind of a quick overview of what we do, and then just to deep dive on the next slide into our domestic abuse policy. So as I mentioned, this is key. You need the policy, and then you need all of the culture and the wraparound to make it actually happen. But just to summarize what we've got in place as a firm, to Anvita's comment earlier, we've got a pretty broad definition of domestic abuse. As you can see the list there: psychological, physical, sexual, economic, and emotional abuse. That's quite broad, and making people aware that that's, there's a whole range of situations in which they can be considered, eligible, if you like, for this domestic abuse support is quite important. For us as a business, this is important. You heard Susan at the top of the call out some of the stats, which are just shocking, frankly, in this day and age. But the extent of this through, Baringa's workforce, everybody's workforce is quite significant, and making sure that we've got the support for what is, a large chunk of your workforce is very important. And then on the right column there, I've just listed out the support we do actually provide, to just give you an idea of the kinds of things we've got in place. So emergency accommodation for both our employee and children, if relevant, in case of a need to seek emergency accommodation. We offer short-term interest-free loans, and that can get into people's accounts within 24 hours. So very, light touch. We kind of give the money and then ask questions later kind of concept. So it's very rapidly available. Additional paid leave, as Susan was mentioning, this can be a very long and protracted process for people. So we provide up to 10 days additional paid leave for people to attend court and all of the other things that typically need to happen. And we've got a very strong employee assistance program, 24/7 support, and as Anvita and Susan were mentioning, there's an obligation on us to make sure we're referring people to external organizations to ensure that they're getting the proper professional support that they need as well. We're not obviously qualified to be able to solve a lot of these things, but we certainly do recommend and help people to access the information and support that they need externally. So that's a quick run through. I think I'll hand back to Susan at this stage.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Jim. And are you finding that, you're starting to think about how you align your work on domestic abuse with the duty to prevent sexual harassment? Is that something you're really grappling with?
So for us, I think the domestic, we've had that domestic abuse policy in place for some time, number of years. As you say, the employee harassment in the workplace is evolving, and that's almost playing a little bit of catch up to what we've got in place in terms of the domestic abuse. But yeah, we're needing to ensure that kind of keeps aligned over time. This isn't a one and done thing, so as you embed it in culture and individual teams start to have open conversations about this, we let individual teams and businesses have the latitude to be able to provide whatever level of support they deem necessary. Some teams this is not particularly major issue, but for other teams it can be, and it's something that they come back to on a fairly regular basis and make sure that there's practical day-to-day support for people as well.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. I think there are a couple of things out of that. You know, we learn from our members that, and from people who have themselves experienced domestic abuse, that having flexibility of the support that an employer is able to offer is really key. So while it's important to have a domestic abuse policy, people really want to know, if I do come forward and ask my employer to help me, I need to know the sort of thing that they'll be able to do, because that gives people, you know, comfort and control over what might happen next. So having a domestic abuse policy and setting out the support is really crucial. But when it comes to the actual individual person, what they need might be very different. For one person, it might be just a little bit of flexibility around when they arrive and leave, or it might be the ability sometimes to work from home. I mean, it's just a whole range of different things and at different times. And there may be long periods of time when somebody doesn't need anything, but then an incident happens and they need some time or whatever. So I think that flexibility is key, because the individual will know best how to keep themselves safe.
And even a further build on that is around, you know, we've got a reporting mechanism where, and we encourage people to report any sexual harassment incident, no matter how small. And you're right, there is a bit of a stigma, or a bit of a, you know, assumption by people that if you go into if you report something, that it's going to become a huge issue, right? And HR are going to get involved, and there'll be, you know, all sorts of bad repercussions, and including with domestic abuse, that, you know, there'll be a bit of a sledgehammer response. So what we try and do is make sure we calibrate that response. So we encourage reporting, but on the proviso that there is a variable response. We will, you know, respond to people's individual needs. They may not need, you know, emergency accommodation straight away. It may, as you say, it may be a low level, and something that, you know, over time is something that they can speak to their advisor with, or their line manager with, and just need to make some accommodation or adjustments. But other people, it may need to be a very fast response, or, you know, they'll want the situation to be monitored, and then, you know, when there's a development, then that's something that can trigger certain things. So it's definitely something that needs to be thought through.
Very flexible. I sometimes think about it as, you know, the moment of a crisis where, you know, there may be, you know, helping somebody to potentially inappropriate way to escape a situation. But, you know, often people will, for all sorts of good reason, decide they, you know, it's the right thing for them is to stay in that situation, but nonetheless they need some safety planning around, you know, what happens if, sort of thing. I'm talking about the stigma. I was going to turn actually to Anvita. So we quite often hear that, you know, people completely understandably, you know, don't want to share at work, don't feel able to share at work or seek support, but nonetheless, obviously, you know, work may be impacted. And sometimes it can be, sadly, in the course of a performance review, that it, you know, somebody actually shares, well, the reason my performance has dropped is because, and explaining the experiences they're having. Is that something that, you know, comes across your desk as a legal advisor to employers, you know, and what sort of advice do you, if that does happen, what sort of advice do you give to an employer to handle that sort of situation?
Yes, sadly, it is something that does come across my desk. You know, you often will have situations where things like erratic attendance or poor performance might actually be linked to an underlying issue of domestic abuse, and these things are perhaps disclosed during the course of a performance improvement process or a disciplinary process. Whereas, you know, to Jim's point, obviously encouraging and having a channel where employees can report concerns is vital, because it ideally you would have those issues reported through those channels so that employees can be signposted to support, rather than in the midst of what's already quite a difficult process, and you know, can sometimes be a potentially adversarial process when you've got a performance improvement or disciplinary. But if those issues do come to light, then my advice to employers is to take a step back, to, you know, acknowledge that the issues related to the domestic abuse would, of course, have an impact on performance related concerns and disciplinary issues, and effectively sort of switch gears and then talk about, you know, what support they can offer to the employee, what considerations they need to make for working arrangements going forwards. You know, so sometimes employees' performance may be erratic because they're struggling to dial. If they're remote working, they can't work in a safe space, they can't dial into meetings, that's why they're missing them. So, you know, enabling employees to have access to an office where they can come and speak to issues confidentially, potentially, you know, having processes in place where employees are offered time off to deal with issues and paid time off, crucially. And again, that's something obviously Baringa is offering, and some employers do offer, but it's not mandatory at the moment to offer employees paid time off for domestic abuse issues. So there's a whole package of measures which I know your organisation, you know, helps employers with. But it's certainly, I would stop and not progress as if the domestic abuse issues aren't an important consideration there before making any further decisions on the future of that employee's employment.
Thank you. That sounds really some really practical advice there. Thank you, Anvita, for employers dealing with that difficult situation. Jim, we sort of touched on the fact that employers will sometimes employ, you know, victims and survivors of domestic abuse and also perpetrators of domestic abuse. And I think most employers come into this area understanding the need to support and that duty of care towards their employees and support people impacted by domestic abuse. And then, you know, there's the follow-up thought, well, if we've got people who are experiencing domestic abuse in our workforce, we may sadly also have perpetrators. You know, maybe not the same situation, they may not both work in the same place, but although that may be the case in bigger organizations, that does happen. But nonetheless, you may have somebody, and it may come to your attention that somebody is a perpetrator of abuse, for example, if they're arrested or they need to attend something, they have to tell you about it, or you may start getting worried, or a colleague might get worried about somebody's behavior in the workplace. Do you have any ideas about, you know, how in a workplace to sort of intervene more early in those sorts of situations? Because you can see how that, you know, that could be a really challenging situation to deal with.
Yeah, well, not to repeat the point I made earlier, but having a clear reporting system and the kind of the rules of the game, or the expectations that people can have around what happens when they do report. So you're dead right. You know, perpetrators are in the business, right? Just statistically, that's just the way it is.
Yeah.
And what we want to do is spot them early and offer the support and help to them, right? I mean, you know, this is a very complex social, personal, you know, issue, and you know, we regularly have men and women in the business. You know, this is a both sexes who do have, you know, been making unwanted sexual advances in the workplace, or we may, as you say, hear of situations where they're perpetrators of domestic violence, and providing them with, so everybody's thought is, well, just exit, you know, just put in place an exit plan to get that person out of the business, which is really, you know, if everybody believes that's what's going to happen when you report somebody, then nobody's going to report anything, right? So you need to have a way in which there's a managed process. Obviously, HR need to get involved as early as possible, but they don't have to be involved in a, you know, this is the end of your career conversation.
Yeah.
There needs to be, we have got a program in place to help people to correct, you know, sexual harassment, domestic abuse. Yeah, so that is definitely something we encourage, and having the mechanisms in place that people can safely report those things helps us spot it earlier, intervene earlier, and avoid, you know, bigger problems basically down the line. So from an employer's perspective, that's definitely a priority for us, is to make sure we're spotting early and offering the support as early as possible as well.
And you know, I was really struck by what you said about, you know, thinking of an exit plan, but actually, you know, when dealing with a perpetrator, the safety of the victim and survivor and their family has to be at the centre of it. And somebody, a perpetrator losing their job, may actually exacerbate things for them. So it is a really complex area, and a really tricky thing for an employer to deal with when that situation arises. Just one last question for Anvita, and then my colleague Aisha is going to come on and just pick up some of the questions that we've had coming through in the Q&A box. Anvita, in terms of future changes, there's been a private member's bill about paid leave. If you wanted to talk a little bit about that and any other sort of developments that you may foresee, just be useful quickly before we move on to other questions.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, Susan, a private member's bill has been put forward actually by an MP who was formerly at Hogan Lovells, just out of interest. But it would introduce 10 days paid leave for employees who are victims of domestic abuse, similar to the protections that are already offered in Northern Ireland, actually. Now, I can't really speculate as to whether the bill will be passed into law. It looks like it's having a reading in June, which suggests that perhaps it may not be high up on the priority of the government, but we will see. So that's something to certainly look out for. And beyond that, I would say developments on the employment rights bill, because at the moment it is very much a draft. So there may well be further changes to it going forwards.
Yeah. Absolutely. So watch this space. I just think over time that we will see further tightening up of the expectations of employers in this space. But there are lots of employers who, like Baringa, are already doing amazing work in this space. So it's a direction of travel, I think. So Aisha, would you like to join us? Beam me up, Scotty. Here she is. Aisha, would you like to pick up some of the questions that we've had in the Q&A? And we'll aim to finish about 5:02, because I'm always conscious that people would like a chance to get a coffee before their next meeting.
Yeah,
Aisha.
of course. Thank you so much. That was a really interesting and insightful presentation, and we've had loads of great questions. So just a couple of sort of practical questions to start us off. Will the employment rights bill relate to all harassment or just sexual harassment? And then just in terms of the new duty in the Worker Protection Act, will third parties include customers?
Yeah, so I'll take that one. So the employment rights bill, the protections against third-party harassment relate to all types of harassment, provided they involve a protected characteristic, as opposed to just sexual harassment. And in relation to the Worker Protection Act, the duty to prevent sexual harassment, as I mentioned before, it doesn't actually exclude third parties. So as long as an employee has been subjected to unwanted sexual conduct in the workplace by an individual, the rights are engaged. So a third party could include customers or clients, and that's something when you're looking at the risk assessment in order to take steps to address the duty to prevent sexual harassment, the relevance of kind of the sector and the type of organization. So if you are an organization, for example, that has a lot of customer facing activities and social events as part of the kind of work environment, those types of issues should be considered when thinking about things like security and measures to prevent sexual harassment.
Brilliant, thank you, Anvita. Next question, are there any examples of employers being included in a domestic homicide review so that national learning can be applied to the workplace? Can anybody answer that one? And it might be one that we actually speak to the advocacy after fatal domestic abuse after the session for input as well.
I can do a brief answer on that one, which is that sometimes employers are involved. It's important to remember that a review like that it's not about apportioning blame. It's about understanding learnings and being able to share those learnings with all of the agencies that might have been involved. And my understanding is that employers can be invited to provide evidence, and employers may have an awful lot of very useful information that might inform those learnings. And certainly I've spoken to some of the chairs of those reviews where they have found input from employers, the ability to talk to employers, super useful. But it's also the case that sometimes employers can misunderstand what those investigations are about and the purpose of them, and therefore be very, really, really concerned about being involved in them. But the answer to the question is yes, they practically can be. And one of the things I would like to do is to do a review of those reports and the learnings for employers, because I think that could be something very useful for everyone on the call about best practice and what one learns from those situations, which I mean, it's just tragic for everybody involved.
Yeah. Thank you, Susan. What would be the best way to handle a situation where, as an employer, you recognise an employee is a victim of domestic abuse? They recognise their own situation as abusive. How could an employer deal with the duty of care they have for an employee in such a scenario when they're not recognising it themselves and they're reluctant to actually act on it?
Yeah, I can take that. So I think this will manifest through performance. So Baringa, we run like a lot of firms, quarterly performance reviews. So if we're seeing issues on performance, and it's the manager's responsibility to understand what the root cause of that is. If it becomes apparent that the employee is a victim of domestic abuse, then we're making all of the support available to them. Obviously, you can't force people to take that support if it's something that they don't recognize or need. But what we do find is helping people to understand their personal situations and work-life balance and how they're operating within the company is an important part of their growth and their ability to develop it within the business. So normally it's through training is the short answer to the question, and it's just trying to help the person understand their own situation through reflection and support through ongoing training and development.
Aisha, could I add to what Jim said on that one? We often hear, and we have some of our amazing group of ambassadors who each have their own individual experience and different experience of domestic abuse. We often hear that people, who've suffered domestic abuse for years actually don't recognise that what they are experiencing is in fact domestic abuse. And I think that's something it's really important to highlight, because it's something I suspect quite a lot of employers do not know, that both the victim just may not realise. It's been normalised over such a long period of time. Sometimes they've just got no idea. And certainly one of our ambassadors said, I wish my employer had an awareness raising poster on the back of a toilet door, and I might have looked at it and I might have asked myself the question, is what I'm experiencing normal? And in the same way, actually, people realizing that their behaviors are not good behaviors. We've once had done an awareness raising session where a person came up to us afterwards and said, thank you so much, that has really made me think. I am going to go at home and reflect on my own behaviors. I mean, absolutely fascinating. I'm very self-reflective and very brave to share that. But I think that's a big issue. And so the fact that people don't recognise that they themselves, are experiencing domestic abuse makes it even harder for an employer. So I would just simply say, please, if you're worried about somebody, please keep asking. Don't just ask once, just keep asking.
Yeah, and not to drain the question, but having those open conversations in the workplace. I mean, shared experiences and safe spaces, and exactly as you say, Susan, for people to share their experience and other people to realize, oh, hold on a second, I'm in exactly the same situation. What does that mean for me? So, yeah, the White Ribbon use a lovely phrase, which is their aim is to normalize this, so it becomes like talking about the weather. So that's where you aim to get to, is that people in you know,
Mm.
work situations can just share that experience and just understand, you know, they're not different or you know, suffering from things in unique ways. It's actually pretty, as we know from the stats, you know, sadly normal.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. I really like that. Just normalize it and make it something that's okay to talk about within the workplace. On that really powerful note, I'm going to bring the session to a close just with some final points. Thank you so much to Anvita and Jim for sharing your insights today and being with us and supporting the Insight Hour. And thanks to Susan for also sharing your insights. It's really great to hear from you all. We have had a few questions we haven't been able to answer, and we will take them away and respond to the ones that we can do, and share the written summary and the recording within our newsletter. So please keep an eye out for it. If you don't receive the newsletter, please sign up to it. You can contact us, and there should be a link in the chat there where you can sign up to it. The next Insight Hour will be on Tuesday, the 25th of March, and we'll be looking at the long-term impacts of domestic abuse and the practical support employers can provide. So there's a link in the chat there where you can sign up, and it's also available on our website, and that can be shared to colleagues across the business, anybody who may be interested in attending. So please do join us if you can. We also have our next in-person event, the networking event on the 20th of March at Portcullis House in London. The event is going to focus on tech and domestic abuse, looking at how tech can be used by perpetrators to abuse victim survivors, but also how it can be used to provide that support. We'd really love to see you there, so please do join us if you can. We're also interested to hear if there are any topics that you would like us to cover off in our Insight Hours or other resources, so please get in touch with us if you have any ideas. Thanks very much for being with us today, and thanks again to our speakers, and please do join us for one of our in-person or online events in March. Thanks everyone.
Thanks, Aisha. Thanks, Jim. Thanks, Anvita.
Thanks all.
Thanks, everyone.